everyone, Sarah here. Wanted to come on here for a quick second to let you know that future episodes of Crime in Congress are going to look a little different. It's not an easy decision, but I've decided to take a step away from the podcast for now. But don't worry, Harley is not going anywhere and she will continue to give you the dish on all things crime and Congress, along with some new faces. Thank you so much for listening and keep tuning in.
She's Sarah.
She's Harley, and we're gaveling in another session of Crime in Congress.
Terri Schiavo wasn't at her funeral. Instead, she was with her husband, who had her cremated and celebrated in a private ceremony while the nation and world mourned in a public manner alongside Terri's parents. This is the story of Terri Schiavo and the complicated question, do we have the right to die? Before we jump in, I want to warn listeners that this week's episode will be light on the crime and heavy on the politics. I remember studying the Terri Schiavo case in my bioethics class in high school, and honestly, it stuck with me ever since. That's why I'm very excited to discuss the landmark case with none other than Representative Debbie Wasserman-Schultz, a Democrat from Florida who is the first female guest and first Democratic representative to join the pod. She just keeps breaking glass ceilings. She'll be hopping on in a little bit, but in the meantime, let's get to know Miss Terri Schiavo. According to terrischiavo.org, which is where I got all of the information about her early years, Teresa Marie Schindler, who went by Terri, was born December 3rd, 1963, in Lower Moreland Township, Pennsylvania. The oldest of 3 children, her parents, Robert and Mary Schindler, described her as, quote, shy but comical child who had an affinity for music, animals, and the arts. She kept a small circle of friends and was dear to schoolmates, neighboring families, and her own extended family. Her mother said that she would spend hours rearranging her stuffed animals in her bedroom as a child, and when she got older, her passions became John Denver music and Danielle Steele romance novels. Terri also loved to draw, was social, and loved their dog named Becky, and she was Catholic. She didn't date much until she hit 20, when she met her first real crush, Michael Schiavo. The two were attending Bucks County Community College and quickly hit it off. In fact, he was the first man she ever kissed. By the time Terri was 21, she and Michael were married, November 10th, 1984 to be exact. And in 1986, they moved to Florida. This move may have had something to do with Disney World because the couple actually honeymooned there. In Florida, Terri worked as a bookkeeper and Michael worked as a restaurant manager. Through her job, she met a friend named Jackie Rhodes. The two started to do almost everything together, from shopping to visiting Terri's grandma at the nursing home. They were besties. She confided in Jackie that she and Michael were trying to have a baby, but that her menstrual cycle was irregular, so she needed to go see a gynecologist to see what was up. Her irregular cycle might have had something to do with her rapid weight loss. She was losing weight and losing weight fast. In fact, she was the thinnest she'd ever been in her life. At 26 years old, she weighed only 110 pounds. I'm not sure how tall she was, but this was certainly far below a normal weight for someone her age and size. Quoting a Washington Post article, if she had developed an eating disorder, she hid it well. Of course, people can be very good at hiding their eating disorders, but I find it notable that her husband, who is presumably the person closest to her, insists that she was eating normally. Terri also confided in Jackie that she and Michael were having marriage problems. Now, every marriage has its problems, and I don't think this was like abuse or anything like that, but it's worth pointing out. A source of their fighting might have been money, though. According to Jackie, the very last time she spoke to Terri was after she went to the hair salon. In true bestie fashion, Terri had been going back and forth with Jackie about whether to dye her hair blonde, as she had been for a while, or go back to her naturally dark hair. When Jackie called to see what the final decision was, she didn't have the call she was expecting. Terri was sobbing because she and Michael had gotten into a fight about the cost of her hair appointment. Jackie consoled her the best she could, and unfortunately didn't seem to report whether Terri was blonde or brunette at the time of this convo.
Okay, so we don't know if she actually just got the hair done. Okay.
My guess is that she went blonde because it's expensive to maintain blonde hair.
Yeah, that's what I would think too, yeah.
But if you have information about Terri's hair color on this day in 1990, please come forward. Jackie had no way of knowing that this would be the final conversation she ever had with her BFF Terri, because the next day, in the early morning hours of February 25th, 1990, Terri would suffer heart failure from a severe potassium imbalance and wind up in hospice care, diagnosed with hypoxic encephalopathy, which is a severe brain injury that occurs due to lack of oxygen.
Do we know why there was such a bad potassium imbalance?
It was likely tied to her weight loss, but it's kind of a chicken and egg situation. Was she losing weight and that caused the potassium imbalance, or was there an underlying issue that caused her to lose weight? Shockingly, we don't know what caused this.
Wow.
Doctors were never able to come to a firm conclusion. I think the common belief is that she probably was suffering from an eating disorder that she hid, that it led to this potassium imbalance, and that's how she lost the weight and ended up in hospice care.
That's scary.
That is where Terri would remain, in a persistent vegetative state for the next 15 years.
Wow. In hospice.
In hospice care.
Wow.
But a lot, and I mean a lot, would happen between the day Terri's life changed forever in February 1990 and the day she died, March 31st, 2005. After a couple of weeks, Terri was taken off her ventilator, according to terrischiavo.org, and was able to breathe on her own, but still required a feeding tube. By June of that year, the courts granted her husband, Michael Schiavo, plenary guardian status. This meant that Terri no longer had the legal rights to make her own decisions, or anyone else for that matter, other than Michael. This type of status is issued when the courts decide that the individual lacks decision-making capacity. It sounds scary, but it's basically for people who are in Terri's situation, a persistent vegetative state with no signs that they will be able to recover. And her husband, Michael, was the natural person to take on this role on her behalf. That same year, Michael brought Terri to California to have a brain surgery before she was returned in 1991 to a rehabilitation center in Florida. Now, this is where things start to get a little dicey, and the version of the story depends on who you talk to. According to Terri's family, during this time she began to show signs of improvement, saying words like no, stop, and mommy. I'm not positive Michael would agree with that, though, because it wasn't long before her physical therapy treatments were stopped altogether. Later in 1991, Terri was moved to a nursing facility in Largo, Florida. 1992 is when Terri's legal troubles first began. Michael sued for medical malpractice, claiming that Terri's doctors had failed to detect an eating disorder, which ended up costing her her life as she knew it. Michael actually won that suit and was awarded $600,000 to himself and $1.5 million to Terri, $760,000 of which went into a trust to pay for her long-term medical care.
I'm kind of interested that he won that suit.
Yeah, I think because it was civil,
I
the
see.
bar is a little bit lower.
Huh.
Not long after this case, you start to see, this case being the medical malpractice suit, you start to see a divide between the Schindlers and Michael. You see, Michael believed that Terri had no hope of recovery and that therapy would be useless, potentially even cruel, and give everyone false hope. Her parents, on the other hand, believed that the therapy was working, pointing to her supposed progress the first go-around, and wanted to use her trust to provide for both medical and therapeutic care. That's the parents' versions of events, at least. According to Michael, her parents were really interested in getting a cut of the settlement money. This disagreement, combined with others, including, importantly, Michael denying Terri medical care in a seeming attempt to facilitate the end of her life, would wind up in court, where the Schindlers would contest Michael's right to guardianship over Terri. They of course lost, but an irreparable chasm was starting to form in this family, a debate that would soon divide the country. Terri's parents believed she had the right to live, and Michael believed his wife had the right to die. But things were about to get even dicier, because Michael is about to meet a woman named Jody Santozzi.
Uh-oh.
Jody Santozzi, in her early 30s, was a brunette divorcee with 90s bangs. According to a Tampa Bay Times article, which in researching this, I learned that Tampa Bay is not a city and is in fact in St. Petersburg. They have a sports team, so I don't know why they're not a city, but whatever.
Because St. Petersburg doesn't roll off the tongue as well.
That is true. Anyway, according to this article, the two met at a dentist's office. They hit it off, bonding over, quote, dinners and long talks, and eventually fell in love, even though Michael was still married to Terri.
This will not end well, I fear.
It's messy. Outside looking in, though, it seems to me that Michael did the best he could with a terrible situation. Having recently witnessed grief up close, I've learned that everyone handles it differently, and you can't judge the decisions that someone makes when they're in the throes of it, especially when they are doing something safe that makes them happy. Okay, that got deep there for a second. My apologies, Crimestituents. There's no good segue out of that, so moving on. Despite Terri's parents initially encouraging Michael to start dating, and the fact that he was, by their own admission, a devoted husband to Terri who waited 3 years after her accident to start dating again, and visited Terri more than anyone else, the new romance, combined with a dispute over money and Terri's care plan, made a bad situation even worse. Things only got more tense when the couple moved in together and had 2 children under 2.
Oh, wow.
But Michael did not marry Jody while Terri was alive and did not refer to her as his wife. He maintained that he was married to Terri and that his love was shared between the 2 women, however complicated and unusual that may be. Personally, I read this as a very innocent relationship between 2 people who didn't want to do life alone. But Michael's subsequent actions would leave many people, including the Schindlers, questioning his motivations heavily. In May 1998, this is more than 8 years after Terri entered a persistent vegetative state and showed no definitive signs of improvement, Michael petitioned the court to have Terri's feeding tube removed, knowing that it would cause her to lose her life. This difficult decision, according to Michael, was made with Terri's best interest in mind, arguing that he'd had prior conversations with Terri where she insisted that she would never want to be kept alive on life support and knew if she could make the decision herself, she would choose to die. Terri's parents were outraged. They heavily disagreed with Michael's assessments, saying that Terri did have hope for recovery, wanted to remain alive, and that Michael was really just trying to eliminate Terri from his life so that he could inherit her estate and officially start a new life with his live-in girlfriend. Ouch.
And to be clear, 8 years and no improvement?
8 years and no improvement. There is this video that floats around where, like, you can see Terri's, like, tracking a balloon and she seems to recognize her mom. I talk about it a little bit later.
Okay.
But even that is up for debate as to whether or not that's actually what's happening in the video. And that is the closest we have to a sign of improvement. A video that shows that she might have been able to recognize her mom.
It's a tough situation.
It's a really hard situation. I feel for everyone involved. Clearly, this was an issue that had to be resolved in the courts. And on January 24th, 2007, the trial to determine whether Terri would live or die kicked off in Pinellas Pasco County Court. According to Michael's attorney's opening statement at trial, on that day close to 10 years ago, my client, Mr. Schiavo, lost the wife he knew. Her parents lost their dreams in hopes of a full life with their daughter and her siblings, and friends lost a shining presence in their lives. So in this case, there is no final judgment order, decree, that can ever bring Teresa Schiavo back. If this court grants the petition and permits Teresa Schiavo's artificial life support to be removed, all the parties will have to suffer the agony of watching a beloved one die, even though it is my client's belief and wish that it is what his wife wanted. If the court does not grant the petition, Teresa Schiavo's body will be maintained in this condition, perhaps for decades, and there was no victory or win in that for anyone. The defense, representing Ms. Schindler, argued that while Terri was in a persistent vegetative state, she actually had recognition that I mentioned earlier, submitting a video that suggested Terri was able to recognize her mother, and that all medical professionals, quote, came to the ultimate conclusion that the feeding tube should be maintained. They also asserted that Terri believed life was sacred and should be preserved, and that Michael had too many conflicts of interest to make the right decision on behalf of her daughter. After 3 days of testimony, on February 11th, 2000, Judge George Greer ruled that Terri would have wanted to die and ordered that her feeding tube be removed, which would cause her death in 1 to 2 weeks. The Schindlers were devastated, understandably so. From their perspective, the court just gave their daughter a death sentence. They petitioned to allow for swallowing tests to be performed on Terri to see if she is able to consume food on her own, but the judge denied that request. But if you think this is where this story ends, think again, because we are just getting started. I'm not going to bore you with all the legalese of this case, but it suffices to say that the judge stayed his ruling to allow for the Schindlers to exhaust their appeals, and they were determined to do so. This legal battle would continue on for years. The tube would be removed, then it would be ordered to be put back in, then it would be removed again, then it would be ordered to be put back in. And this went back and forth until October 7th, 2003, more than 3 years after Judge Greer's initial ruling, which is where our story is going to pick back up, because that is when politicians decide it's time to get involved. By the fall of 2003, the Schindlers had filed a federal lawsuit challenging the removal of their daughter's feeding tube. Jeb Bush, then governor of Florida, filed a brief in support of their position, meaning he wanted Terri to live as part of their case. But that lawsuit wouldn't actually end up going anywhere because the judge would rule that the federal courts didn't have jurisdiction in this case. That will come back up later, so keep it in your back pocket. By the time the governor got involved, though, this was no longer a family dispute. It had turned into a nationwide debate, with the Center for Persons with Disabilities filing a suit on Terri's behalf and, quote, supporters of the Schindlers urging Jeb, exclamation point, who I just can't talk about him without mentioning the exclamation point, to intervene, which of course he had no jurisdiction or authority to do. That is until October 20th, 2003. Because on that date, the Florida House of Representatives would pass Terri's Law, which is a bill allowing the governor, at this time, Jeb, exclamation point, to issue a, quote, one-time stay in certain cases. This gave the governor authority to issue an executive order requiring that Terri's feeding tube be reinserted. Isn't it kind of insane to think that someone's personal health decision can be made via executive order?
Yes, that does sound a little insane to me.
Yeah. This was about to get even crazier, though, because on October 22nd, in a Rose Garden press conference, President George W. Bush would comment on the case, saying that his brother, quote, made the right decision.
You know, the comms team is like, you said what?
Yep. This private family dispute had officially made its way to the Oval Office, and the Schindlers wanted to keep this unprecedented momentum going. Michael had other plans. He immediately filed a lawsuit, with the backing of the ACLU, interestingly, claiming that Terri's Law was unconstitutional. While this case was making its way through the courts, something interesting happened. As part of Jeb's executive order, a court-appointed guardian was established for Terri. This person had no authority to make decisions on her behalf, but would advocate for her in court. The person Jeb chose was University of South Florida professor Jay Wolfson, who had medical and legal degrees. So it seems like a good choice.
Yeah.
On December 1st, 2003, he issued a report saying that Terri was, quote, in a persistent vegetative state with no chance of improvement.
So kind of a slap in the face to Jeb over there.
A little bit.
Huh.
But it didn't change his mind.
That didn't go how you thought it would, did it?
No, it didn't. He ended up issuing an entire press release that ended with, quote, "Nothing in Dr. Wolfson's report leads me to believe that the stay should be lifted at this time, or that Ms. Schiavo should be deprived of her right to live." This case would make its way to the Florida Supreme Court, where they would rule against Terri's law, finding it unconstitutional. In my opinion, this is the right call. The executive branch and legislative branch have different authorities for a reason. It should surprise no one, however, that Jeb was ready to take this fight to the Supreme Court. That fight, like his presidential bid, was short-lived.
So much Jeb slander. I love it.
I know. I really don't have anything against him, man. I'm sorry, Jeb. You're just too easy to poke fun at. The Supreme Court of the United States refused to hear this case, meaning the lower court ruling stands and Terri's law was overturned. This means that the executive order requiring the peg tube to be inserted was overturned, and Judge Greer's ruling that Michael can remove the tube was now in effect. But that doesn't mean that her feeding tube was going to be removed right away, because now it's time for Congress to get involved.
Oh, good.
Yeah, things always get better when Congress gets involved.
Yeah, much less complicated when Congress gets involved.
Now, I'm going to breeze through this part of the story because in a minute, we will be joined by a representative from Florida, Debbie Wasserman-Schultz, who can give us a firsthand account of what happened and will be a much better source than me. So the high-level overview here is that a bill was introduced by Rep. David Walden, a Republican from Florida, on March 8, 2005, entitled the Incapacitated Persons Legal Protection Act. Remember when I said that the federal courts declined to intervene in this case because they didn't have jurisdiction?
Uh-huh.
Well, this bill would explicitly give the federal courts jurisdiction to review the Schiavo case, allowing for more appeals and more court hearings and more stays of Greer's ruling. While this bill was pending in Congress, Greer stayed his order once again and the feeding tube remained in place. The lobbying behind this bill was insane, and some credit Terri's brother, Bobby, with getting this bill to the floor for a vote. Shockingly, this bill passed by voice, with members crossing party lines to support and oppose the legislation. I found this to be very surprising because Terri's case was becoming a proxy for abortion, which is an infamously difficult conversation for people with opposing views to have. Basically, the right believed in Terri's right to life and wanted her tube to be inserted, and the left believed in Terri's right to choose, which in this case was a decision for her surrogate, Michael, to make. In this day and age, there absolutely would have been a recorded vote on this, and I imagine debate would be bitter, to say the least. The Senate, in its classic nature, didn't pass the same bill as the House, though. It instead passed a private bill, which I had never heard of before.
Yeah.
Basically, a private bill, quote, provides benefits to specified individuals. Individuals sometimes request relief through private legislation when administrative or legal remedies are exhausted. Many private bills deal with immigration granting citizenship or permanent residency, end quote. So basically, it's a bill that only applies to select people. That wasn't the end either, though, because the Senate would actually delay its Easter recess and work on a Saturday. Gasp.
Seriously.
To reach a compromise on the bill that the House passed, going a step further than their previous action with the private bill. The bill they ended up voting on, S-686, was closer to the private bill that the Senate passed than the more broad version the House approved, but it included provisions from both. Referred to as the Palm Sunday Compromise, they passed the bill in both chambers and it was later signed into law by President Bush. This meant that the Schindler's case was going to be heard in a federal court, giving them hope once again. But that hope was, once again, short-lived. The judge would rule in favor of the peg tube being removed, and after appealing their case all the way to the Supreme Court, the body would decline to hear the case and the lower court ruling would stand.
Wow.
Mm-hmm.
So all of that for right where they started, essentially.
Exactly.
Wow.
In fact, the Schindlers never had a win in court. No court ruled in their favor. And there were a lot of people ruling.
Yeah. From a lot of different backgrounds.
Mm-hmm. Terri's feeding tube was finally going to be removed. Demonstrations broke out across the country, and people were calling on Governor Bush to violate the court order and prevent Terri's tube from being removed. Obviously, he couldn't do that. The legal process had been exhausted, Terri's tube was removed, and it was only a matter of time until she passed. That time came on March 31st, 2005 at 9:05 a.m. President Bush issued a statement on her passing, saying, quote, "Today, millions of Americans are saddened by the death of Terri Schiavo. Laura and I extend our condolences to Terri Schiavo's families. I appreciate the example of grace and dignity they have displayed at a difficult time. I urge all those who honor Terri Schiavo to continue to work to build a culture of life where all Americans are welcomed and valued and protected, especially those who live at the mercy of others. The essence of civilization is that strong have a duty to protect the weak. In cases where there are serious doubts and questions, the presumption should be in favor of life." She was buried in Clearwater, Florida, with her grave marker reading, "Teresa Marie Schiavo, beloved wife, born December 3rd, 1963. Departed this earth February 25th, 1990.
Wow.
At peace, March 31st, 2005. I kept my promise."
Whoa.
Right?
Obviously, that was paid for, designed by Michael, her
Yes.
husband.
Obviously. Michael would be investigated for his involvement in Terri's death, but no wrongdoing would be found. Terri's case continues to inform medical schools and health policy experts around the globe, many of whom are still searching for the answer to the question Michael Schiavo was brave enough to ask: do we have the right to die? And with that, Sarah had a very interesting conversation with Representative Debbie Wasserman-Schultz, so it's time to bring her in.
So what would your death row meal be?
My death row meal, hands down, would be a lobster dinner. Maine lobster, not Florida. Sorry to my home state, but Maine's lobster definitely wins out. Cheese and bread also would be like also my desert island foods, but a lobster dinner.
I think that is a excellent choice. Now, if you were arrested, God forbid, which member of Congress are you calling to bail you out?
Okay, that's also pretty easy. Either Jamie Raskin or Dan Goldman.
And why is that?
Well, besides that they're brilliant lawyers and dear friends, I think they probably also have the right amount of compassion to and would care about completing my case.
That's awesome. Good. I'm glad those people are on speed dial, right?
Yeah, they are actually.
Now, what?
Anytime soon.
Oh, yeah. So this is the last fun question. What is one thing that is technically harmless and legal, but that you think should be illegal? So for reference, we had Representative Burchett on, and he said that touching pizza slices that you don't intend to eat at a buffet is something that he thinks should be illegal.
Okay. As someone who's guilty of probably having touched buffet food, not necessarily eaten it, I apologize, Tim. So close talkers. Close talking. Like getting way too close in your personal space to have conversations. That should be illegal, even though it's technically not.
That is a great answer, I think, as well. Definitely sometimes people need a breath mint too.
It's not even the breath mint. It's just that like I'm a huggy, pretty warm person. Everyone hugs and kisses folks down here in South Florida, but all ethnic groups actually. Mm-hmm. But yeah, having a sustained, prolonged conversation in your personal space should be illegal.
All right, noted. We'll add that one to our list.
Okay.
All right, so now we're going to get in the case questions. So take us back to 2005. What was Congress like during the Terri Schiavo debate?
Oh, wow. Very, very different than now. I mean, especially for me, because I was a freshman and I was literally a baby freshman. I mean, the Terri Schiavo case came up very quickly. Sort of we got called in on an emergency session after Congress had adjourned for the 2-week spring recess, like the one we just had. And nobody that we had a lot of members that didn't come back. But more broadly in Congress, you had more, somewhat, even though Tom DeLay was the majority leader, every single thing wasn't partisan. And there were more opportunities to reach out to the other side. But, not on a case like this, this case was really emblematic more of the kinds of things that are going on today. The case really drew partisan political battle lines, and even though back then it was. I'll just give you an example. I'm sorry, I'm being erratic in the way I'm answering the question, but so I had a bill. I'm a freshman in the minority. I'm the lowest form of human life, and the chances of my moving anything were slim. But I was able to go to Tom DeLay and ask him to sponsor my first bill that I passed, and to co-sponsor my first bill that created the Jewish American Heritage Month in every May. And he agreed. Even though he was the majority leader, he agreed to co-sponsor it. We actually got it to the floor. We passed it. And so there was just more opportunity to, I passed an amendment in that time period just by going to Republican members, and it was an amendment that affected young children related to mercury exposure. And I found all the members that had young children or had, really, had newborns or toddlers, because they would have had the most recent experience with knowing that you shouldn't eat, your, wife when she's pregnant shouldn't consume foods high in mercury. And I was able to pass an amendment over the objections of the majority and the floor manager of the bill on the Republican side, because parents of young kids knew that mercury was harmful.
Right.
And that would be nearly impossible today.
Yeah. No, that's wild what 2 decades will do.
The amendment wouldn't even be made in order today, so I wouldn't even have had an opportunity to plead my case. So the fact that I even was able to was kind of a miracle.
Wow. No, that's great level setting. I think the listeners would really appreciate kind of setting the scene for us. Now, you said in a press conference, a clip which aired on C-SPAN in March 2005, that federal involvement in this case was, quote, politicizing a family tragedy. Do you still feel that way today?
Oh my gosh, absolutely. And it was politicizing a family tragedy all the way back to the fall of 2003 in the Florida legislature, when the Republicans in the Florida legislature gave Jeb Bush in the law the authority to specifically reinsert Terri Schiavo's feeding tube over a court decision that had said that her husband should be able to ask that it be removed. And so you fast forward till basically the end of the case, and the family's legal appeals process was basically exhausted, and they got the United States Congress and the President of the United States involved to try to force the decision, a medical and legal decision that rested with her husband, to get the Congress to determine that no, she did not have a traumatic brain injury, or that there was not, that there was somehow recognition and cognition there when it had been medically determined that there wasn't. And you had diagnosed, you had Bill Frist, who was a U.S. senator, who was a doctor during that period of time, diagnosing Terri Schiavo from the Senate floor. Just all these wildly, having never seen her in person, wildly inappropriate things for the Congress. The best way I can describe it, my feeling about it at the time, is that this would just be the beginning of a completely slippery slope. Who would we say no to? If we got involved in the Schiavo case, that specific instance, was that what Congress was going to be doing going forward? We would have a whole new category of legislation. Just private family disputes are not something that's supposed to be settled in the Congress because the Congress is a political body, and the courts are objective, and we have a separation of powers for a reason. And so, yeah, I still feel very strongly about that. And it was politicized because there was a memo that came out actually at that time during the aftermath of the debate, because U.S. Senator from Florida Bill Nelson was going to be up for re-election, I think that cycle, and the Republican Party circulated a memo that was leaked that said, well, this is going to be a great political issue. It's going to be really tough for Bill Nelson. So it was obvious that this was about politics.
Wow, fascinating. So during this time, what was the outreach like from your constituents? What were they telling you?
But let me just another example.
Yeah.
So another example is that, and this was why it was odd that I mean, I was, like I said, I had been in Congress for 10 weeks at that point. So and we got called back into session from the spring recess. It was this bill was debated on a Sunday, on a Sunday night, and one of the key things that I tried to bring out was that when George W. Bush was governor of Texas, he signed a bill into law that allowed for the withdrawal of feeding tubes and life support, just like what was happening in the Schiavo case at that moment. And in fact, an infant, just before we were debating that bill, had a hospital withdraw their life support over the objections of the parents, because the infant was in a persistent vegetative state and had no hope for, or actually I'm not sure, but there was deemed no hope for survival, but was on life support. And, now you had then President Bush flying across the country to sign this bill into law at 1 a.m. Did his conviction completely change? It seemed much more like it was politics.
So that when you guys were called in, that was, I believe it was Palm Sunday.
Yeah, it was.
So how did you feel the day that bill passed?
It was demoralizing. It was deflating. It was, we're the greatest democratic, small d, democratic institution in the world. And we were clearly violating our own Constitution, and we were politicizing a very personal matter. It was at the behest of the parents of Terri Schiavo, with the husband on the other side. And it was just, we also did it. It happened, by the way. So we were there on Sunday, but all of this unfolded from Friday to Sunday.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, over 2 days. Right. So there was no time to sort of vet this with the public. Not that it would have mattered, but you went in and it was just a snap decision. There were court rulings that brought the case to the point where her feeding tube was going to be withdrawn again, finally. So they just raced to act, and between the mixture of politics and religious fervor, frankly, and trying to satisfy an evangelical Christian base, my family had just recently, which I shared on the House floor, my own family had just recently been through, my husband's family, the need to withdraw my husband's great aunt's feeding tube as well. And, it was such a devastating decision, but it was a personal one. And we could not have imagined if there was a family dispute over that decision that anyone would have reached out to their member of Congress to help resolve it. So right. It was deflating.
Yeah, absolutely. Now we kind of talked about a little bit earlier how back in 2005 you were able to kind of reach across the aisle. Did you have any unlikely allies in this fight to kind of take this bill down?
Yeah, what was amazing. So a member of Congress from Florida then, her name was Ginny Brown Waite. She and I served in the state house together, in the state legislature together. I was in the state house when she was in the state Senate. And she reached out to me clandestinely, actually, and didn't even want her staff to know that she was reaching out to me, because she had just been elected to Congress the term before and was familiar with the case. And she was from the Tampa Bay area. So she asked me to get her my materials and the information and the backup to help her make a decision. And then I'm getting chills thinking about this. This was the most amazing thing. Now, think about the dynamic in Congress. Most of the time, nearly all the time, Republicans sit on one side of the chamber, Democrats sit on the other, especially during heated debate. Ginny Brown-Waite came across the chamber when we convened on Sunday and sat next to me on the House floor on the Democratic side. And she took time in opposition on the Democratic side of the aisle and spoke against the bill.
Wow.
And voted against the bill. Yeah. That was amazing courage. She wasn't in, a super safe seat from my recollection, but it didn't matter. For her, that was completely on principle. And I just wish we had more of that now. It was, it's hard to imagine that happening now.
Right. Yeah. So kind of in terms of bringing together your caucus, the Tampa Bay Times quoted that this case did kind of bring your larger caucus together. Do you agree with that?
Well, it did afterwards. I mean, we had a lot of members were scattered across the globe on congressional trips or family vacations because it was Passover and Easter time.
Yeah.
It just adjourned on Friday, and we were called back in on Sunday. So we didn't have all of our members come back. I want to say about 100 Democratic members came back, something like that. And it was a very fraught issue. I don't even think the majority of Democrats voted against the bill. I can't 100% recall, but I'm pretty sure it was still a majority of Democrats that voted yes. But you should check that to make sure. So it was now 20 years ago. But after the next morning is because we debated this bill for 3 hours on Sunday night, from about 9:30 in the evening till about around midnight. And so, Palm Sunday at late at night, not even late at night, but, sort of prime time people were riveted to C-SPAN to the degree there was a huge uptick in people watching what was going on in Congress because it was such an unusual situation and the news was covering it. So a lot of the public knew what was going on and what happened, and what the result was from Congress going through this process. And the coverage of it all weekend. So the next morning, there were polls that came out that showed that the overwhelming majority of Americans opposed Congress intervening in personal, private, family matters, and specifically opposed Congress getting involved in whether or not, her feeding tube should be reinserted. And the compromise, actually, the quote unquote Palm Sunday compromise, what it really boiled down to was that I think they eventually had enough of their members who found it objectionable for Congress to directly require the feeding tube be reinserted. And so what they did was that they ordered a federal court, totally unconstitutional, but ordered a federal court to consider the case, I guess just one more time. And essentially, from my recollection, when that happened, the judge just gavelled in and said, not appropriate, and didn't go through a full hearing. But the overwhelming sentiment afterwards and over that next couple of weeks, because it was debated, for the next few weeks in the public sphere, was that the Republicans and President Bush really got it wrong, misjudged totally how families across America would have felt. So many families go through that gut-wrenching decision when someone is on life support. It's the most heartbreaking, excruciating decision that anyone can make, and it's just no place for Congress or the executive branch. It really, hopefully, never even makes it in your family to a court, But there has to be some objectivity, and that's and that's how Americans clearly felt about it. So that brought our caucus together, as far as our values and our principles as Democrats. That we needed to make sure that you separated religious we separate religious decisions and principles from our small d democratic ones, and we certainly don't violate our Constitution because of a political over an opportunity to politicize a personal family tragedy.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think I know the answer to this, but I'm going to ask it anyways. Was justice served for Terri Schiavo?
I don't see how you could say that over the incredibly lengthy period of time, once Michael Schiavo, her then husband, decided that it was time to withdraw her life support, that justice was served, because I mean she was used as a political pawn, and sort of removed from this devastating family tragedy. And so I think, I suppose the end result, because she was allowed to peacefully go to her resting place, which was important, was some measure of justice. But the family being, the family's tragedy being brought so publicly, and her personal horrific healthcare situation being politicized like that, diminished the justice that she deserved.
I want to give you a chance to give any other takeaways, anything else you want to say, make sure that listeners hear.
One of the things that this case illuminated for so many is the importance of having a living will and an advance directive, as well as a healthcare surrogate. Because Terri was only, I think, 27 years old when she had the healthcare tragedy that caused her to be in a persistent vegetative state, not a time, and then and had not had prior health issues. So, at the time, it really underscored for people how important it is to have those conversations very specifically with your family, use a living will, have a healthcare surrogate, and make sure that if, God forbid, someone tries to politicize your family tragedy, or even on a much smaller level, there's a lack of, you avoid the lack of clarity about what you would have wanted. That's an important lesson for people to come away from this tragedy. So hopefully, in Terri's name, we were able to, through the spotlight on this issue, help a lot of people avoid that kind of conflict when God forbid the worst happens in your family.
Thank you for that. And thank you again for coming on the podcast. I think you've brought a lot to this episode, and I'm really excited for our listeners to hear it.
Thank you so much. Great to be with you.
So what do you think, Sarah?
I think that I can't believe it just took, she was in a vegetative state for 15 years. Mm-hmm. And it's fascinating, too, that every single court ruled that the feeding tube should be taken out. So I don't know. This is really fascinating.
Yeah, the only wins the Schindler's got in court were like, okay, you need to reinsert the tube so that you can continue appealing. Like, it wasn't a ruling that no, the tube should be inserted.
Wow.
It was just a technical, like, okay, you still have appeals left and she can't die while you're appealing.
Wow.
So put the tube back in.
Really terrifying too, if in fact it is true that, she didn't want to be in that state, right? And that if she had any, perception of what was going on for 15 years, that's really heartbreaking.
Yeah. It's a really sad story, and I think it's crazy that it got to the level that it did. I think that this always should have been a private family matter. Yeah, I'm in the fact too that they brought them back on Palm Sunday when everyone's supposed to be back in their districts for Easter Sunday. That's really fascinating, and it shows just how big of a case this became. Yeah, kind of out of nowhere. Right. Not out of nowhere, but a little bit. Absolutely. All because of Jeb. All because of Jeb! Exclamation point. Do you think that when Jeb's mom is mad at him, she's like, Jeb! Exclamation point, whatever his middle name is, Bush? Yeah, I like to think so. Yeah, I think she does. All right. And with that, Sarah, do you want to gavel us out?
I sure will.